Alright everyone, welcome to the second video of this channel, where I'll basically go over on how to play Gin Rummy, which is another card game that I have really loved while growing up. And what I'm also going to do for this video is, just like last video, I'm going to throw you guys right into the deep end and show you guys a real Gin Rummy match that I played. However, if I do feel that there is an area for expansion, I'm going to take you guys away from the screen onto a black screen and just further expand on whatever idea it is I want to talk about. Alright, first, some foundational things to get out of the way. First, Gin Rummy is a card game that's usually played with two players, using a 52 card deck that excludes the jokers. And the object of the game is to essentially get either 100 or 50 points, although the amount of points is really up to your discretion. And the way you get those points is by forming mounts. Now, how do you form those mounts? I'll get into that a little bit later into the video. The first thing you want to do when starting a match of Gin is basically decide who's going to get to go first. And this is really up to your discretion and how you really want to do that. Once you decide on who's going to go first, the dealer is going to deal 10 cards to each player, and they will also place a card face up at the center of the table. The person that was selected to go first now has to make a decision. They can either choose to pick up the card at the center of the table, or they can decide to leave it. If they do decide to pick that card up, they get to incorporate that card into their own hand. However, they must also choose another card in their hand to discard. The card that they end up choosing to discard can then be placed at the center of the table again. Once they do this, the turn passes on to the second player. However, if the first player decides not to pick up that first card, the second player will then have the opportunity to decide if they would like to pick up that card. If they do decide to pick up that card, they must also follow the same course of action. They get to incorporate that card into their hand, but they must also choose another card in their hand to discard into the center of the table. If they decide to not pick up that card, they get to leave the card as it is at the center. If both players decide not to pick up the card at the center, then nothing really happens. However, no matter the scenario that occurs, whether or not the first player picks up and discards, or the second player picks up and discards, or if neither player picks up and discards, the end result is pretty much the same. There will be a pile of cards at the center of the table with one card face up at the center of the table as well. And this is really where the game begins. Both players will basically take turns picking up a card, incorporating it into their hand, and choosing another card in their hand to discard into the center of the table. Now, when it's your turn to pick up a card, you basically have two sources where you can pick that card up from. The first source is from the pile of cards that's face down on the table. Your second source is the most recent card that was discarded by the other player, which will be face up. No matter the source of where you get your card from, the course of action is still similar to before. You pretty much incorporate that card into your hand, and you choose another card in your hand to discard face up into the center of the table. The only real difference between choosing from the pile of face down cards versus choosing from the one face up card is basically the freedom of choice you get when deciding on a card to discard. If you choose to draw a card from the pile of face down cards, your hand will now consist of 11 cards. And you can choose any one of those 11 cards to discard into the center of the table, including the card that you just drew. But if you decide to take the card that was face up, your hand will still consist of 11 cards. However, you cannot discard the card that you just drew. Basically, any card that you take face down can be discarded on the same turn. Any card that you take face up cannot be discarded on the same turn. Notice that if on a future turn you wanted to discard that card, that would be allowed. Both players basically spend the majority of the game alternating their turns like this, picking up a card, then discarding another card, picking up another card, discarding another one, and so on. Now, in the clip, as my opponent and I are continuously picking up a card and discarding cards, I want to bring your attention to two particular things. The first one is the three fours at the very left of my hand. The second thing is the word deadwood at the bottom right corner and the number associated with that. Those three fours are actually an example of a meld. In Gin Rummy, a meld is basically a grouping of at least three cards connected to each other in some way. There are two types of melds that you can form, sets and sequences. A set is basically a meld where all the cards are of the same rank. For example, ace, 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 or 10, 10, 10, king, 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 5, 5, 5, you name it. However, remember that melds need to be at least three cards long. So two twos, or two eights, or two queens do not unfortunately count as a meld. However, since melds need to be at least three cards long, this also means that you can form four card melds in this way. For example, four nines or four jacks, for example. The second type of meld, the sequence, is exactly how it sounds. It's basically a consecutive sequence of cards that are all of the same suit. For example, this could look like the 2, 3, and 4 of spades. It could also be the 5, 6, 7, and 8 of hearts. It could even also be the 9, 10, jack, queen, and king of clubs. These types of melds can extend as long as possible, as long as all the cards are of the same suit and they are consecutive. However, in Gin Rummy, you should also note that aces only count as 1, not 11. So a queen, king, ace, and 2 of clubs would unfortunately not be a meld. So basically, in a game of Gin Rummy, you would be picking up cards either from the face up pile or the face down pile with the goal of trying to make as many melds as possible. All the unmelded cards in your hand are basically added together to give that deadwood number that I mentioned earlier, with all face cards counting as 10. Believe me, you want this number to be as low as possible, and I'll explain why soon. So, in a game of Gin Rummy, both players are taking turns picking up a card and discarding a card, with the goal of trying to make as many melds as possible and making the deadwood number as low as possible. Both players basically keep doing this until one of the players decides to end the round, either by knocking or going gin. Let's start with knocking. If a player's deadwood number is less than or equal to 10, the player can decide to knock, but note they don't have to knock if their deadwood meets this condition. If a player does decide to knock, the knocker and their opponent will both turn their cards face up and count the amount of deadwood that they have. If the knocker's deadwood is less than the opponent's deadwood, then the knocker scores an amount of points that's equal to that difference. Let's see this with an example. In this clip, my opponent had a deadwood of 1 and they decided to knock. At the time they decided to knock, I had a deadwood of 11. So my opponent gets to score 10 points, because 11 minus 1 is equal to 10. However, knocking actually has a disadvantage, because the knocker faces the risk of being undercut. What this means is that if the knocker's deadwood is greater than or equal to the deadwood of the opponent, then the opponent actually gets to score the difference between the two hands plus a 20-point difference. So as a knocker, you really do not want to get undercut. In this clip, I actually undercut myself on purpose to give you guys an example. So when I knocked, I had a deadwood of 9, while my opponent had a deadwood of 2. And since 9 is greater than 2, my opponent actually gets to score 32 points. 25 points as a bonus, and 7 points because 9 minus 2 is equal to 7. I know I previously said that undercutting grants a 20-point bonus rather than 25, but honestly, this just depends from player to player. On this platform that I'm using, it ends up being 25 points. There is one final aspect of knocking that I should probably go over, and it's called the layoff. Basically, if someone decides to knock, the opponent can actually try to reduce their deadwood by playing cards on the knocker's melds. In the clip earlier, remember how I said that my deadwood was 11? Well, that wasn't actually entirely true, because at the time my opponent knocked, my deadwood was actually 14. However, you'll actually notice that the three of clubs in my hand didn't actually count towards my deadwood. And the reason for that is because that three of clubs could have actually been used to extend my opponent's massive sequence of clubs that they have in their hand. This is essentially what the layoff is. If any of your cards can be used to extend your opponent's melds, they essentially won't count towards your deadwood. Furthermore, in the clip, if I hypothetically had the 7 of clubs, I could have also used that to lay off more cards, because I could have used it to extend the set of 3 sevens that my opponent had, and lower my deadwood even more. So therefore, the layoff is actually pretty important, because it could mean the difference between someone getting a few extra points or being down a whole 20 points. Now, knocking is only one way you can end a round of Gin Rummy. The other way of doing so is by going Gin. At its core, going Gin is actually just knocking in disguise. You're basically just knocking with a deadwood of 0, which pretty much means that all the 10 cards in your hand fit into a meld. If a player goes Gin, their opponent does not get to lay off any cards, and the player that goes Gin gets to score a 25-point bonus plus the value of the deadwood in the opponent's hand. We can see this in the clip here. You'll notice that by discarding that 2 of clubs, all 10 of the cards in my hand will all fit into a meld, and therefore I can go Gin. Once I do go Gin, I immediately score 25 points, plus the value of the deadwood of my opponent's hand, which is 4. So this allows me to score 29 points in total. Finally, there is one special form of going Gin called Big Gin. You'll notice that whenever someone takes their turn and draws a card, they momentarily have 11 cards in their hand. Well, if that 11th card actually fits into a meld, that's called a Big Gin. A player that goes Big Gin basically scores the same way as if they went regular Gin, except they just get to earn 6 bonus points on top of that. If someone knocks or goes Gin, the round basically ends. The entire deck is reshuffled, and 10 new cards are dealt to each player, with another card being placed face up at the center of the table again. At the start of each round, the player that did not knock or go Gin in the previous round gets the first pick at the card that's face up at the center of the table. From then on, both players will play multiple rounds of picking up cards, discarding cards, knocking, going Gin, or going Big Gin. The first player to reach the predetermined point goal, which is usually 50 or 100 points, wins the game. And that's how you basically play Gin Rummy, everyone. Just like last video, please feel free to rewatch any parts of this video if you're a little bit unclear on any of the rules that I just explained. What I'll also do is I'll also leave the rest of this clip for you guys to watch, just so you guys can see how a real match of Gin Rummy works. Take care, everyone, and I hope that you guys have a fantastic day.